Well, hello, everyone. My name is Lei Guang. I'm the executive director of the 21st Century China Center at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Strategy. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here today. Pleased too that our partnership with Bishop School has continued to this day. It's been, I think, 7-8 years. Now, today's local program will be presented by Michael Davidson, a faculty member of the 21st Century China Center, an assistant professor with joint appointments at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and in the Jacobs School of Engineering in the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department. Michael's work focuses on renewable energy, particularly the electricity market, both on the technology side and on the side of the political economy of energy, technology, and regulation. He was trained at MIT and Harvard. He was a Fulbright scholar, has studied China, and spent a lot of years in China, and worked at the nonprofit Natural Resources Defense Council as well. He was just selected as the fellow of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. National Committee is the main sponsor of this particular town hall. So in the next segment, Michael will sort of briefly reflect on the content that was just presented by Fareed Zakaria in the discussion. And then he will briefly share his views on a very timely topic, that is how U.S. China relations will make or break our climate. So there will be time left at the end for the audience to ask questions. Please use the chat box to submit your questions. So I will collate some of these questions for Michael to respond. Michael, the Zoom is yours.
Thanks, Lei. And thanks everyone for joining and sticking around. It was a really interesting talk by Fareed Zakaria. So as Lei mentioned, I'm going to provide a few brief commentary and maybe my own little anecdotes on some of the things that Fareed mentioned, and then maybe spend 10 at most 15 minutes sort of framing the climate change challenge of this whole relationship. And hopefully leave a lot of space for all of your questions, because I know you've been listening patiently to everything that Fareed and Steve have been talking about. So, I think I largely agree with a lot of the comments that Fareed Zakaria made. I think I appreciated that as understanding that, we're moving to this world where US and China really dominate. This is, in some sense, a bipolar world, but a Cold War is a policy choice. And then he raised a couple of really interesting threads of the very contentious U.S. China relationship, which I'll get to in the climate change segment. One thing that I thought was quite interesting was the observation on trade and protectionism. And certainly the observation the U.S. engages in a lot of protectionism. It's true. We put in we have lots of import tariffs. We have various Buy America provisions, et cetera, including in the Build Back Better plan. And he was equating that to how China has many non-market features. I do think it's important to separate these two facets. So having trade measures which kind of affect how your economy behaves at the border, and interventions in the domestic economy itself. China's state intervenes far more in its domestic economy in terms of what firms do, helping to support firms and various aspects. And in some aspects in Build Back Better, what we're trying to do is we want some of those more domestic interventions. We see that China's industrial policy has been successful in several key areas, and so in some sense we're trying to replicate what works and keep out the stuff that we don't like. And it's important to do that while minimizing the overemphasis of protectionist measures, as Fareed Zakaria mentioned, because of the negative impacts that has on American consumers. Another part of trade that's really important is this employment and manufacturing. And he had this really interesting point that you have orders of magnitude more jobs lost to automation in the US than to opening to China trade, in particular, usually using China's accession to the WTO as a key milestone. This is also happening to a wide extent in China, where automation is having a huge impact, arguably a larger impact than in the US, as he noted. And just one area that probably is striking to a lot of folks is that coal employment in China was greater than 5 million people in around 2013, around 5.3. Since that time, it's fallen below 3 million. So China has shed 2.5 million coal jobs in less than a decade. 2.5 million. We have about 40,000 people employed in coal mining in the entire country here. So they're shedding millions of coal jobs almost entirely due to automation. So they're having a huge impact at the same types of impacts that we're facing in this country. I think he raised climate change in a context, and we'll get into a little bit more of that. I think he made this comment that there's no opportunity for a win-win, and the cooperation opportunity is relatively narrowly constrained to just working together to help out the poorer countries of the world to provide development assistance. And then he went on a little bit of a tangent about power shortages and renewable energy. I have lots of opinions on all of these things. I agree with a lot of what Fareed had said on a variety of issues, but here he's just dead wrong. I think he way overstated the technology gaps at RE. And the recent power shortages were not caused by renewable energy buildup. So if you look at California, Texas, China, it's not due to an excessive reliance on renewable energy. If anything, it's due to our kind of fragile infrastructure, which is a combination of fossil-based infrastructure, some renewables, but fundamentally you're seeing weather-induced but institutionally exacerbated challenges with the power sector. And for folks that want to get into a little more detail on what's happening in China on that front, I did a Sinica podcast recently with Kaiser Kuo where he spent a little more time getting into what was the specific contributing causes to China's recent power shortages. So I think the win-win on climate is difficult to see, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think it's difficult primarily because of the politics and all of the ways that we could see win-wins and finding ways to work together on climate, technology, and trade in particular are now very sensitive topics. And also these things are being attacked on national security grounds. So there's just all sorts of red flags in politics that come up when we talk about working on climate change with China. So let me shift gears and just, kind of frame a little bit of a question and maybe a debate, and folks can weigh in to see which side of this debate they land on with respect to climate change. So we know climate change is really important in the U.S. China relationship because U.S. and China collectively account for more than 40% of global emissions, the two largest emitters. And in order to keep global temperature rises to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, we know that global emissions need to reach net zero by around 2050 to 2060. So that's the kind of target. And the US has its goal, which Biden had proposed and now is feverishly trying to get through Congress some legislation to actually support the goal, is a 50% reduction by 2030 relative to 2005 and net zero by 2050. China wants to peak emissions by 2030 and get net zero by 2060. So if we both achieve those goals, we're roughly in line. Now, China could certainly go more quickly, particularly with respect to its peaking target. But in terms of net zero targets, that's where we're going. That's the correct direction. Now, the question is, can we go there faster, and how do we go there? What's going to be the best mechanism to get there? And I think there's this question out there that, can the U.S.-China relationship now in its more competitive nature lead to a race to the top? Or will the lack of cooperation between the US and China inevitably harm our efforts on climate change mitigation? And so I think it's important to just take a step back and recognize the US played a really important role in getting China to take on more climate commitments. So if we go just sort of the history of these international climate conferences, we have one coming up in 2 weeks in Glasgow. 2009, Copenhagen, some folks may have heard about, was the first summit where China took on an international climate commitment. But it wasn't that China and the US were really seeing eye to eye. In fact, China mostly tried to undermine the US at those negotiations. 2014, things had changed. You saw much more a softening between the US and China on this area. They started to engage in a lot of cooperation. You had working groups, you had technical cooperation, including in clean energy, joint announcements, and then pivotably joint commitments to take to the Paris Agreement on behalf of both the US and China. So it was a joint announcement, joint ambition on the commitments. Then the US withdrew from Paris in 2017 following Trump's taking office, and the US-China climate discussions were just ended, right? So you basically had 4 years where China was on its own with respect to these climate commitments. And then we come back now to 2020, 2021. China has committed on its own to do this neutrality target. U.S. is committing on its own to do its own peak emission, own net zero commitments and its own climate commitments. And so we kind of get the sense that, oh, maybe the US and China are just going to kind of go off and do their own commitments, and they'll be as ambitious as possible, even without cooperating or coordinating with China. So I want to go through, what I think are maybe 3 or 4 main arguments in sort of that folks make in favor of this idea that the US and China as competitors can help us achieve climate change goals more quickly. And then I'm going to give you some of my thoughts on where I think cooperation may be necessary. So the first one is, I was already alluding to, that both sides are already making commitments without any explicit coordination. Xi Jinping made the carbon neutrality commitment at the UN General Assembly last year, while Trump was still in office, without any coordination with the US, not a joint announcement with the EU or any other party. This seems to be prima facie evidence that cooperation is no longer needed, right? If both sides are kind of making their own commitments and without coordinating, maybe they don't need to do that. So I think it's important to look at what are the motivations within China and the US that are leading to these types of climate commitments. So on the China side, with Trump's withdrawal, China gained some reputational goodwill by stepping up on the climate stage. And it can also generate some pressure on the US by being on the side of developing countries, which it does primarily in solidarity on the climate finance angle. So historically, developed countries have never given enough money on climate finance to help developing countries scale up low carbon technologies and to avoid high carbon development pathways. So China has generated more goodwill in that process. And China's also generated a homegrown concept of ecological civilization, which is now connected directly to Xi Jinping and is somehow tied to the party's legitimacy. So there's a sense that China is going to try to embrace this, and for its own party's legitimacy, it's going to have to follow through on its climate commitments. On the US, the motivations, clearly number one is there's a very strong political base that's supporting rapid climate action. And there's also a desire, I believe, on the part of President Biden to regain more US stature internationally. So you can imagine if these threads just sort of continue in parallel, that you could have some more commitments without explicit coordination. But cooperation might also be necessary in this front. So in the US, right now, we see much less rhetoric, at least influential rhetoric, that's pointing to China's lack of progress on climate change as a reason for us to hold back. Now, if you rewind about 10 years to the last major climate debates that we've had at the US federal level, when we were debating the Waxman-Markey bill, the cap and trade bill in 2009, 2010, this notion that we are not going to commit to making emissions reductions unless China is taking its fair share was front and center of this debate. We see this much less now, so that's one reason maybe cooperation might be needed, but this can change, especially if the US engages in very costly action while China is perceived to not engage in very costly action, and that could lead to some drawback or retrenchment later on. Now in China, Xi Jinping still needs to sell carbon neutrality to a large array of interests that are pushing back and trying to keep coal as the central part of China's energy economy. So if the US is not perceived as contributing to this, then China might also not want to do more, and Xi Jinping could face some backlash for pushing ahead of what is actually needed and making instead of focusing on key interests at home. I think a second argument that folks would make is that we've already negotiated the Paris Agreement, so right now it's just the commitment stage, and so we're just countries making commitment and implementing commitments. That seems to require kind of less global cooperation. And that's true. We have the COP26 in Glasgow coming up in a few weeks. This is the main forcing point for a lot of discussion around climate change. And there's not a lot of important text left to discuss. I mean, there's one section on markets and offsets, but broadly speaking, most of the Paris Agreement's already been negotiated and finalized. But there's still a lot at stake in two aspects. One is we know we're very far from our collective ambition goals on climate change. So we know we all need to raise ambition, increase our targets. Key part of the Paris Agreement was to lock in these check-ins about global ambition. So if we see we're not on track to meet 1.5 degrees, then we'll come back and we'll take stock and countries can update. So that's one aspect where these multilateral forum can be important. Another one is more targeted ambition raising, is pointing out which countries are not pulling their fair share of the weight. And these COPs provide a key fora to discuss that. So a third that comes up is that economic competition could result in similar or even better outcomes to cooperation, right? So U.S. is actively engaged in a Green New Deal, which is heavily engaged. It's essentially an industrial policy to help build up all sorts of sectors in the U.S. and deploy them very rapidly with a big focus on green jobs. And it frequently uses China competitiveness and competitiveness of China and decoupling to some extent to justify this policy. So could this motivate the US to act more swiftly than, say, global harmony and cooperation? That's the question. China, for its own part, is also engaging in really broad policies on technological development in high-tech sectors, renewable energy, and trying to indigenize and decouple some of these tech sectors because of, for example, the trade war and other policies put in place on restricting China's access to technology. So it seems that both sides are kind of agreeing to just not agree, right? So maybe we don't need cooperation. But the key here is that China occupies a really important place in global supply chains for clean tech. So solar has fallen in cost by 90% since 2010, wind and batteries by 70% over that period. And that's in large part due to efficiencies and globalization economies of scale associated with China's part in this global supply chain. And this is the reason now we can discuss, in some sense, very ambitious targets like 100% clean energy by 2035. This is also a key source of tension that comes from these trade wars and these tariffs. So trade measures, as Fareed Zakaria pointed out, have been very ineffective at bringing back US jobs in any significant numbers. And they just raise the cost for US consumers in a variety of goods, and renewable energy is no exception. Solar modules in the US sell at roughly 50% premium over the global average sales price, and part due to tariffs and to other factors. The second part of why there's some benefits to cooperating with China on these tech and climate tech side is, US and Chinese innovators and entrepreneurs are benefiting from close cooperation. There is a global competition for talent and finance. And we want to, of course, keep the best talent, foreign talent here that come here to study and to create businesses and continue their inventions. So that's one part of the equation, which the US, the current administration needs to do a better job of. But we also want to help US innovators find the best opportunities to scale up. And sometimes scaling up means engaging in global supply chains. And finding the cheapest, lowest cost way to bring components and scale up quickly so that you can actually bring a technology to market. So you have this domestic priority and these global supply chain benefits, which are kind of creating this somewhat of this contradiction. And I think so industrial policy, as embodied in the Build Back Better plan, is really good and important. And it's likely more effective and more politically acceptable than, for example, a carbon tax. Though there are some people in Washington right now trying to prove me wrong on that. But it can also lead to really strong protectionist themes. And so there's a delicate balance there, as noted by Fareed in a couple of areas. So the fourth, and I'd say relatively minor argument, is that why don't we just change China's behavior by coercion, right? Let's use trade policy. So let's all put a carbon tax together, and then let's put what's called a carbon border adjustment tariff, which means that for any country that doesn't have a carbon tax on it, we're going to tax goods that are imported from them at the equivalent of whatever the carbon tax would be if they were paying it. So coercion sounds nice in theory, right? If you can't get them to work with to come to the table on your own terms, you might as well just coerce them, right? So if we have enough trading blocks together, we can all get together, agree on a single carbon price, agree on all these methodologies, impose this, and China's going to give in, right? Of course. Well, no. I think this approach really lacks realism because, first of all of our friends and allies are not going to agree on a single carbon price or a single methodology for how to achieve this carbon border adjustment. And second, more importantly, it's essentially going to exacerbate the existing trade war, and we can certainly expect there'll be retaliatory tariffs. And the trade war, by most measures, has failed to achieve its delivered results. So why would you expect that this particular measure is going to achieve where others had not? So just to wrap up here, I think there are many ways for countries to work together on tackling climate change. I think that cooperation, as we envisioned during the Obama administration, may not be in the cards right now, given all the politics that we've discussed. But I do think that at minimum, we could aim for some kind of agreement on clean tech that would be, a commitment to reduce trade barriers between our countries and allow low-cost, clean manufacturing to go to consumers, to enhance deployment, so to collectively raise ambition for how much we're going to deploy, and then to facilitate global responsible supply chains to deliver that product and to manufacture and deliver that product. And I think it would be great as well to re-engage diplomatically on ambition, so collectively raising ambition as well as technical cooperation, two areas that were very promising in getting the two countries aligned in the lead up to Paris, but which have been relatively unsuccessful under the Biden administration so far this year. So those are my thoughts on climate. I think I'll wrap up now and pass it over to you, Lei, and hopefully we can get a conversation going.
Thank you, Michael. Let me just remind the audience again, the purpose of the town hall is really to have a discussion with the community members so we can discuss U.S. China relations and as well as how these relations, the current state of these relations affects our lives at a personal level. So I have a few questions here. Maybe I can get started with you, Michael. Then others, if you have questions, just please feel free either to send it directly to me or send it to the chat group to everyone. So the first question relates back to something that Fareed mentioned, and he said, we don't have green technology at the scale that we need, right? To scale the green technology, it requires the US and China to work together, maybe even to share some technologies, right? So do you agree with that particular rationale? That is that, in order for us to combat climate change, to scale the green technology, the two big countries have to work together to ensure the supply chain, operates smoothly and to be able to deploy the climate technologies at a scale that will make a difference. So that's the first question.
Yeah, well, I think we already share technologies. If you define sharing technologies as trading in them, engaging in supply chains, firms, manufacturing in different locations, et cetera. I think the challenge here is how quickly we can scale up to meet the clean energy goals that we know we need to. So for example, the US installed 20 gigawatts of solar power last year. That was the largest the US had ever installed. China has been installing roughly 50 gigawatts of solar power for about 5 years. So they have a much larger scale, and that's even 50 is far short of what China needs to. It probably is closer to 100 gigawatts to get to a year in order to get to where China needs to go. And here in the US, we probably need to be at around over 100, 150 combined wind and solar roughly to get to our target. So we need to dramatically scale up. That manufacturing capacity needs to come from a lot of places. We care about the cost of it. We also care about the ability to actually put together these factories and create supply chains so that we can actually deliver this product. And right now that's spread out across the globe. I don't think there's any viable pathway now that we could manufacture the entire solar panel supply chain from polysilicon to modules in this country, scale it up to meet our annual clean energy installation targets by, for example, 2035, which is Biden's stated goal for when we want to have 100% clean energy on the grid.
Okay, here's a question about the domestic situation in China. So who are the critical interests that she has to appease domestically with regards to decarbonization plans? So what are the important domestic interests in China that are supporting coal?
Yeah. I think that the carbon neutrality target has done a great job in shifting incentives of a handful of key stakeholders. And, we're not completely shifted yet, but I think it has made a huge impact on the way that two key groups of stakeholders view this challenge. One is state-owned enterprises, predominantly centrally state-owned enterprises, and two is local governments, mostly provincial governments. So if we look at state-owned enterprises, most state-owned enterprises in the energy sector are heavily diversified if we're looking at power. So they have coal, they have renewables. There's a few exceptions with nuclear and hydro, but largely speaking, they're not 100% coal, right? So they have renewables industries, renewable business units. They can scale those up and scale coal down, but they also have to make sure that they don't introduce any major stability issues on the coal side when they're scaling that down. And so coal mining is a huge area here. We've already talked about how they shed 2.5 million coal mining jobs. Well, there's still roughly 3 million there, and now those are using new technology. They're much more educated. There's a lot of reasons why it'd be harder to shed those jobs. On the local government side, if we're looking at provincial governments, they are going to be much more closely dependent on, particularly a handful of provinces, on some of these fossil fuel extraction. So we're looking at Shanxi, Shandong, Inner Mongolia, handful of really coal-heavy provinces. They're going to have a harder time finding what to do to replace that lost revenue and to figure out what to do with all these displaced workers. And so you have those kinds of interests, and then you also have some grid companies and some of the affiliated grid institutions. I think those are more minor. I think the grid company would be perfectly happy if you built a bunch of renewables, as long as you also pay them to build transmission lines to connect the renewables. But they may not be so on board with creating markets, which is going to be an efficient way to integrate some of those renewables. So they may also want to keep some more fossil on board. So you need to work with a lot of these different stakeholders. And I think there's been a major energy sector reform that began in 2015, which is still ongoing, that has gradually eroded some of the power of these previous monopolies and is making some changes to these. And the power shortages and the response to it, which is essentially to embrace markets slightly to a larger extent, shows that there is some traction with these types of measures, and that they have to be accepted by these local governments and the SOEs, because they directly affect high-level policy priorities like energy security. So I think there's a number of constellation of interest there that you need to work for, and you see them coming out in the press. They're talking about, coal is very important. It's the backbone of China's energy economy, et cetera, et cetera. This is these are constant struggles that are taking place in the Chinese discourse, but there has been a step change since the carbon neutrality announcement last year.
Michael, that there's currently energy crunch in China that's affecting the economy and also even people's lives. How do you think this situation will play out in this debate within China about coal, renewable energy?
Yeah. So I go into this a little bit more in the Seneca podcast, all of the details of it, but I think at a high level, some folks are using this power crunch as a reason for doubling down on fossil fuels, which just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because the crisis originated in the fossil fuel markets. The crisis originated because coal prices skyrocketed. You had supply crunch, and the electricity institution, particularly the markets, were not well adapted to respond to high fluctuations in coal prices. So the prices originated in there. It didn't originate with renewables or low carbon or any of these other green policies. It originated fundamentally with coal prices and coal supply crunch. But nevertheless, because it's power shortage and coal is, is referred to as baseload, you heard Fareed Zakaria say, countries need baseload. Well, that's a kind of an outdated concept. You don't need coal baseload power to run your economy. But that is still commonly used to justify more coal intervention. And so we see that coming up in a variety of different contexts whenever there's a power shortage, that, this is the reason why we have to go to renewable. We can't go to renewables, and we have to keep our fossil fuels. So that's a debate right now. I think it's actually a really important debate. I don't think it's going to directly affect China's position, for example, at COP26 in a few weeks. But I do think there's going to be, some serious discussions in Beijing about how much more coal should the country build. On one end, you have folks saying you should build 0 more gigawatts of coal and you start retiring them in 5 to 10 years. On the other side, there's folks saying we need to build 150 or 200 gigawatts more coal. So just perspective, China has roughly 1,100 gigawatts of coal, by far the most of any country in the world. So there's some folks that are saying we need to build 200 more gigawatts of coal to meet expected demand growth and to deal with power reliability or what have you. So I think there's potential for some real conflict here because no country is going to embrace climate change, deep climate change mitigation targets if it seriously affects energy security, right? We couldn't expect any country to take on that kind of a policy, measure. So I think there's some important discussions happening on what is the appropriate policy towards coal, towards fossil fuels in order to manage both of these goals.
Okay, here's a question about the recent announcement about China made about not exporting coal plants. Do you view that as a big concession on China's part, or is that as what Fareed would call China is doing what it needs to do anyway?
It's a really good question. It's not small potatoes, right? China, you saw prior to 2020, you had basically China, Japan, and South Korea as the sole public financiers of coal plants abroad. So if you went to Indonesia and Vietnam, Pakistan, what have you, chances are there's a coal plant being built. It's being built with Japanese, Korean, or Chinese finance. Now in 2020 and 2021, Japan and Korea exited coal finance overseas for a variety of reasons, some domestic, political, some international pressure, and China was left as the last one out. And now China, Xi Jinping at the UN General Assembly announced that they were going to exit coal. And another surprise maneuver. I don't think that it is insignificant. I think there is some potential real cost to companies whose primary business model was developing coal projects, financing, building, constructing, et cetera, and equipment manufacturers. On the other hand, I do think that China was responding to some shifts in what's happening in developing countries, which is those energy plans were shifting away from predominantly coal to fuel switching towards gas and renewables due to local environmental protests and NGOs, as well as the broader market trends that these alternatives are now more attractive economically. So China's seeing there's a shrinking market. If the market is not zero, it's a shrinking market. And you could potentially get some goodwill from these countries by recognizing that shift. So I think it's a very positive step. And I think, we should definitely laud China for taking that on and finally, closing off public sources of coal finance abroad for sure.
That's great. Shifting gears a little bit. Another member of the audience asked a question about succession. And he writes, Deng Xiaoping went to great effort to establish a predictable model of succession. This has been broken under Xi. There's now an expectation that this will be, his term will be extended. And what are the chances that China will return to Deng's model or something like it? Now, I just want to append a note here that in a recent speech, Xi did talk about orderly succession. So what does he mean by that?
That's such a tough question, Lei. I would throw that back to you or probably one of my colleagues who study these the inner workings of Zhongnanhai a little bit more than I do on that. I do think on a variety of areas Xi Jinping has really broken the mold, and that has changed a lot of conventional wisdom that folks have held about U.S. China relations. And so I think it's important that we need to recognize that and to do more research and understand what are the ultimate drivers for change within the inner circle in China. I will say there was a really interesting article, Wall Street Journal, just I think out today or yesterday about the blowback that Xi Jinping is getting for potentially introducing a property tax. So, this notion that Xi Jinping, obviously he has more power than anybody since Mao, but on the other hand, he still faces constraints from other elites and institutional constraints. And so I think it's important for us to really understand what are the boundaries of those constraints and how do we shape foreign policy towards China, recognizing what in fact is Xi Jinping's doing, what are the constraints of the institutions in China, and how do we create better policy that improve relations between the two countries.
Well, let's hope the constraint will be such that he might abandon his plan to have another term. But in any case, there's another question about the human rights and climate change. Are human rights and climate change issues in conflict, especially with regard to Xinjiang, with solar panel supply chains in Xinjiang? Does the U.S.'s desire to affect change in Xinjiang directly have a negative impact on its desire to reach carbon neutral goals?
It's a very good but very difficult question. I think we should take very seriously the allegations about forced labor in Xinjiang, and we need to do more research to figure out exactly the extent to which that has affected the solar supply chain. We're talking about, in Xinjiang, predominantly global polysilicon, which is the key input to creating wafers and cells and modules that go into solar panels. Xinjiang is the dominant source in the world for the production of polysilicon. And so it's challenging for under current measures to actually identify what solar products have polysilicon from Xinjiang or not, which is the stated goal of the U.S. administration to try to trace back those supply chains. I think there are proposals on the table which I think deserve a lot of careful consideration. So, for example, the Solar Energy Industry Association has a proposal for a solar traceability protocol that, if it were implemented effectively, could identify where the polysilicon is coming from. Is it coming from a firm that has these accusations associated with it, or is it coming from a firm that's trying really hard to demonstrate that it does not engage in any of these practices whatsoever and to participate in global trade? I think we should take those kinds of proposals seriously and try to figure out how to make those work for our particular clean energy needs. There's a couple of things there. One is the polysilicon is just a perfect example of how really bad trade policy can hurt us down the line. U.S. used to be a main supplier to China of polysilicon, right? Mm-hmm. Before we put in place tariffs on imported Chinese panels because we in about 2012. After we put on those tariffs, China retaliated with tariffs on our polysilicon, and then they went and built their own polysilicon industry that now dominates the global marketplace, and our polysilicon industry is kind of sitting on the wayside. So there's some real important potential downstream effects of kind of knee-jerk trade policy that I think it really comes out of this polysilicon debate. And then the second is, I think we have to be very, very clear-minded about, are we going to try to put in place measures that limit the solar products that we're getting in this country and whether or not they're free of any allegations of human rights abuses in Xinjiang, or are we going to try to impose that on all of the other countries that buy products from China? I think it's much more feasible from a solar traceability perspective to try to figure out how to do that in our own borders. I think it's much harder to try to figure out how to do that in a credible way and apply that globally. So I think it's a very difficult issue. On the other hand, because it's just one part of the solar supply chain, we used to have a polysilicon industry here that was very large. We can ramp that up again. There are ways to work around that with some smart trade policy to try to alleviate the human rights abuses within the solar supply chain.
Okay, we are reaching the end of this segment. We'll try to end maybe in a couple of minutes. I have a couple of questions here, but let me just to put them together, basically this is a question about the technology decoupling and its effect on decarbonization in the United States. So maybe the question here is, are these two efforts pursuing decarbonization globally and in the US, and the technological decoupling, are they fundamentally in conflict? Can you figure out a way where some technological selective decoupling can take place without affecting the climate change effort by the countries around the world? Can you cordon off, in other words, particular technologies so that decoupling will not so negatively impact climate change?
So I think we would have to look at this and technology by technology. And the mature technologies that we're talking about now, whether it's solar or wind or batteries, they have very globalized supply chains. Now, how are you going to actually cordon that off, right? You could put, and just to give you an example of how trade remedies oftentimes are not going to be the best solution, you could, for example, put a tax on the final solar product, the solar modules. But then firms get around that by importing the solar cells, which are these input to the solar modules, and then just to assemble them in the US. So you get a little bit of jobs, but you don't get the full jobs up the stream. So you force them to create a few jobs here, raising costs for consumers, but you get a few jobs out of it. But is that decoupling? No, because upstream, you're still very dependent on all of the different components that are manufactured in China, in Southeast Asia. And so that is really, those kinds of issues come up in a variety of trade measures where you're dealing with very established technologies that already have very globalized supply chains. So it's just fraught with issues of how would you actually intervene in a way that would make sense. I think there's a much better case to make for supporting manufacturers, not by creating protectionist barriers that support, for example, globally non-competitive firms here by creating barriers to imports, but rather by supporting really innovative firms that are going to be developing products that could then be exported to the rest of the world. Because if the only way that we're developing an industry here is by protecting it from imports, that's not going to be a globally competitive and a huge base of future exports. On the other hand, if we're looking at new alternative technologies and innovative, technologies that we have here, and then we're having struggle manufacturing and scaling up, we could think about providing direct support to manufacturers. There was a proposal that was taken out of the reconciliation bill for an industrial finance corporation that had this at its goal, that it was going to try to provide finance for those kinds of, that kind of middle stage area where it's difficult to get VC interested, but the technology is way past the basic science phase, and to try to figure out how to bridge that gap. I think things like that are going to be much more promising. And there's a lot of those kinds of technologies within clean tech that we could really think about, right? You think about hydrogen or carbon storage, some EV components. There's lots of areas where we could think about targeting manufacturing support in order to develop those supply chains, which develop more of a local ecosystem here in the US. But I don't think you'd want to strangle those industries at the beginning by saying you can't rely on any imported components. You want them to be able to be globally competitive, and U.S. firms are, the U.S. firms that we have are competitive because they have very interconnected global supply chains.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks to everybody who have started, at 4 o'clock today. It's a long program, but I want to end by thanking David Mosley, my partner at the Bishop School, and Susan Zhao, who spent a lot of time making this successful. So coming up, if you are not familiar with the 21st Century China Center, we have a whole bunch of public events, free and open to the public, in the next few weeks. On October 28th, we have someone from Yale Law School to come talk about the U.S. China Scientific Exchange. And on November 3rd, we have Jennifer Pan from Stanford coming to talk about the Chinese state media and how they employ Twitter. And finally, on November 7th, one after another, we're going to have Rana Mitter from Oxford University, who is a great public intellectual as well, to talk about the memory of the World War II and China's new nationalism. And actually at this hour, in 15 minutes, the entire UC system has a symposium on Hong Kong that we are co-sponsoring. So if you're interested, you can click the link in the chat box and log in at 6 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Michael, and have a good night.
Thanks, Lei.